She didn't remember when her legs stopped obeying her, only that the world had narrowed to dust, thunder, and the thudding ache of her own heartbeat. The sky was thick with smoke, the kind that tasted like torn metal, and every footstep of the American soldiers sounded like a countdown. She braced for the nightmare she had been promised since childhood. Foreign hands, foreign laughter. The unspeakable act they swore would come before death. That was what she had been told was waiting for women like her. Better to leap from a cliff than live in shame. Better to die Japanese than exist as property of barbarians. 3 soldiers stepped into view. She squeezed her eyes shut. Silence. A soft, confused breath left her throat, because the soldier closest to her did not touch her. He didn't grab her hair. He didn't smile with hunger. He knelt, slowly, carefully, as if approaching something fragile. His rifle lay against the rubble behind him. With bare hands he plucked a tiny wildflower growing through a crack of broken stone and, without a word, laid it gently in her shaking palms. For a moment she could not breathe. No one had told her mercy had a weight, that kindness could feel heavier than fear. She looked up, expecting a trick, some delayed cruelty hiding in his eyes. But all she saw was exhaustion, dirt, humanity. The most terrifying thing in that instant was not him. It was the realization that if he was not a monster, then maybe everything else she had been told was a lie. Saipan was not a battlefield to her. It was home, an island wrapped in the illusion of imperial protection, cradled by the belief that the emperor's shadow stretched across every horizon. But when the war began to crumble and reality bled through propaganda, the island transformed into a trap with no doors. The Japanese army dug its last claws into the soil here, convinced that if they fought hard enough, screamed loud enough, died violently enough, Tokyo would somehow turn the tide. Civilians did not see strategy. They saw orders, cold, absolute, unquestionable. The command spread through schools, through shrines, through whispered lectures at night. If the Americans land, you will not survive. Not as anything human. Fear was not taught gently. It was hammered. Mothers were told to smother their infants before surrender. Young girls were told their bodies would be violated until death. The last radio broadcasts before silence did not speak of evacuation or safety. They instructed self-erasure. Die before capture. Burn before surrender. Leap before touch. Even prayer changed meaning. People no longer prayed for life. They prayed for a beautiful death. When the shelling began, they believed it was the end of the world, not simply the arrival of another army. The ground convulsed like a living beast. Homes shattered like eggs under artillery fire. Smoke coated everything, hair, clothing, skin, until every face looked like a ghost. And still, the officers barked orders. Do not be taken alive. Women first. Protect your honor with death. We will meet again in the emperor's next world. Honor. That sacred word was used like a knife against them. It was not pride, it was a cage. By the time American transports came into view offshore, most Japanese civilians were no longer planning how to survive. They were rehearsing how to die. Fathers dug shallow pits for final moments. Mothers packed poison packets with the same hands that once packed rice balls for their children. Girls braided each other's hair, rituals of goodbye, not beauty. Propaganda had done something far more powerful than bullets. It stole imagination. They could no longer picture a future. The first time loudspeakers echoed across the island, offering safety, food, and medical care. The civilians did not hear comfort. They heard deceit. An American voice called out in careful Japanese, "Lay down arms. Civilians will not be harmed. Come forward and live." No one moved, because to them those words were not mercy. They were bait. How could the enemy speak gently? Why would a monster offer rescue? Those who did believe, even momentarily, looked to the officers' faces for truth. The officers wore a certainty carved from terror. Better to die Japanese than live shamed. So no one walked forward. Even the children hesitated to cry, as if sound alone could betray them. Days turned into a tightening noose. Food vanished first. Water second. Safety wasn't just gone. It had become unthinkable. like a language forgotten overnight. And as rumors spread that American patrols were moving inland, the pressure reached breaking point. Families began walking one direction, always the same direction, the cliffs. Not toward escape, toward erasure. If a god had stood there then and offered life freely, they would still have stepped past him. That was the cost of perfect propaganda. It didn't just command the body, it conquered the imagination. The island was shrinking. Every hiding place became a tomb waiting to be sealed. Every night the whispers grew louder. They are coming. They will take the women first. Save yourself before the Americans touch you. The irony is unbearable even in memory. People weren't fleeing the enemy. They were fleeing what they believed the enemy would do. Fear replaced oxygen. And so Saipan became an island of no return, not because escape was impossible, but because hope was unthinkable. The people weren't fighting for life anymore. They were running from a future they had been taught to fear more than death. The question hangs like smoke over the story. How broken must a world become for mercy to look like a trap? The cliffs waited. And soon they would take more lives than the battlefield ever could. They didn't jump because they wanted death. They jumped because they had been taught there was no life left. The cliffs did not roar or thunder when the bodies fell. There was no cinematic crash, no dramatic final scream. Just wind. Just silence. The kind of silence that does not come from peace, but from despair so heavy it chokes the world around it. Women held children to their chests like shields of bone, whispering apologies into their hair before stepping forward. Husbands held wives by the wrist not to protect them, but to pull them over together. This was not panic. It was ritual. And the tragedy is that it worked. That is the cruel genius of propaganda. When it succeeds, you never meet the real enemy, only the ghost you were trained to fear. American Marines climbing the rocks below did not fire a single shot. They shouted for people to stop. They begged. They stretched out arms. They waved cloths and helmets and anything bright enough to signal you don't have to die. But a lie that takes root in childhood is stronger than any warning shouted across a battlefield. Most never even looked down. But not all of them jumped. Some froze, their minds split between instinct and indoctrination. Some had slipped, been pulled back, or were too injured to reach the cliff edge. Others simply could not force their feet to move. These are the ones the Marines found, trembling, dirt-covered, waiting for the horror they had rehearsed in their heads for years. They didn't ask for mercy. They waited for violation. The first contact came not from a medic or officer, but a young soldier barely older than the women themselves. He dropped his rifle, lifted his palms slowly, and approached like someone trying not to startle a wounded animal. They recoiled, not because he hurt them, but because he didn't. Mercy was unfamiliar. Touch without threat wasn't something they had been prepared for. He offered water. Their eyes widened. Confusion first, fear second. Water meant care. Care meant dignity. Dignity meant contradiction. Others Marines arrived and carried the most severely injured to makeshift aid posts. They wrapped women in blankets, not restraints, and gave them room to breathe. Some were so terrified they screamed, clawing at their own clothing to offer themselves before the soldiers could take them. They had been told resistance would make it worse. Submission was their last defense. The Marines didn't touch them. This is the moment where shock becomes psychological fracture. If the enemy is not a beast, then what are you? When food was offered, several refused it outright, convinced the kindness was a prelude to something darker. One woman whispered through chattering teeth, "They fatten us before shame." Another cried for hours because the hands holding her bandages were gentle. Kindness was not comfort. It was confusion. Confusion is the first crack in absolute belief. A medic later wrote in his field journal, "They looked at us as if we were death wearing a stranger's face, and when we did not strike them, they did not know how to exist." The Marines tried using interpreters. But trust does not enter through the ears, it enters through contradiction. And every gentle gesture was a contradiction strong enough to rattle doctrine. But the deeper horror came later, when the captured women saw what lay below the cliffs. Bodies, hundreds, husbands, sisters, children. All gone without a single bullet. The enemy had not killed them. Their own belief had. What kills faith faster than proof? At night, when the explosions stopped long enough for breathing to feel real again, the captured women began to whisper. Not just to the Americans, but to each other. Soft, terrified questions that had never been legal to speak before. Why didn't they touch us? Why did they help us? What if everything they told us was wrong? Fear was loosening its grip, but not yet breaking. The women still waited for the moment. The hidden cruelty they assumed must come later, when no one was watching. Trauma doesn't vanish with rescue. It unravels slowly, thread by trembling thread. And the Marines noticed something. The civilians were not grateful. They were stunned. Gratitude comes after safety. This was the stage before belief collapses, the unstable moment where a person is alive but hasn't accepted survival yet. And then word began to spread among the American ranks. There were survivors, women willingly captured, women who weren't screaming, weren't attacking, weren't trying to flee. For the first time, someone in command asked a question not tactical, but psychological. If this many people jumped out of fear, what happens if others learn they didn't have to? That question would reshape everything that came next. Because this rescue, this accident of mercy, was about to become a weapon more powerful than artillery. But first, the Americans had to understand what mercy had interrupted, and what it had woken up. The first moment of collapse didn't come from a military order. Came from a flower. It happened the morning after the rescue patrols brought the survivors back behind the American line. The women sat in stunned clusters, wrapped in worn wool blankets, clutching their knees with the brittle stillness of people bracing for a storm that refused to arrive. They weren't looking at the Marines, not directly. They watched them from the corner of their eyes the way a wounded animal studies the hand that fed it, waiting for the trap to spring. One soldier, Private Miller, barely 20, passed a crumbled stretch of wall where a small girl sat curled into herself like a question mark. She had not spoken since capture. She hadn't cried. Trauma had frozen her into silence. Miller apologized when a loose stone crumbled under his boot, startling her. She flinched hard enough that her knuckles went white. He could have turned away. He should have. There were protocols, cultural briefings, cautionary instructions from above. Maintain distance. Do not escalate contact. Avoid misinterpretation. Instead, without thinking, he crouched. His fingers brushed the dirt near her feet, where a thin stem of color pushed defiantly through the ruins. One living thing in a place built for death. No one would have blamed him for stepping over it. Instead, he plucked it gently and held it out to her. No language, no theater. A silent offering. You are safe. You are seen. She stared at the flower as if it were a paradox. Something that shouldn't exist in war. Her fingers twitched. Slowly, as though expecting a blow, she reached out and took it. That moment seemed small, forgettable, but for the women watching it was detonation. The monster of propaganda had a face now, and it looked unbearably human. The officers on the American side didn't miss it either. In the afternoon, after treating wounded Marines and repairing fortifications, the medical lieutenant reported something not tactical but psychological. The survivors had stopped bracing. Their shoulders were no longer locked in fear. Their breathing had slowed. A few were even, looking the Marines in the eyes. Fear had not reversed, not yet. But it had loosened. That is how indoctrination breaks. Not all at once, but through the smallest unexplainable act of kindness. Later, when the Americans distributed rations, the girl with the flower held it in her lap like a relic. Another survivor, older, skeptical, leaned close and whispered a question nobody would have dared voice yesterday. If they were animals, why would they carry flowers? It was the first crack spoken aloud. Words are dangerous things once they turn on their maker. As dusk fell, some of the Marines shared cigarettes among themselves and looked over the camp where the women rested. There were no fences, no locks, no guards standing with bayonets fixed. They didn't need them. These prisoners were caged by belief, not walls. But inside the Marine command post, something had begun to shift as well. A senior officer, Colonel Abernathy, looked over field notes from medics and interpreters. The reports used the same language again and again. Terrified of us before capture. Expected assault. Convinced capture is worse than death. And then the final note, scrawled at the bottom of a page. Kindness broke the fear faster than persuasion. Abernathy paused. He wasn't just reading a medical update. He was staring at a weapon, a psychological fault line. If propaganda could make civilians kill themselves before meeting the enemy, what could mercy do when they were allowed to live? Across the campfire, one of the nurses, a woman who had stitched together Marines all day, watched the survivors, her voice quiet. "They looked at us like ghosts," she murmured. "They kept expecting us to change into monsters." Then she glanced toward the cliffs visible in the distance. They weren't running from us. They were running from a story. That observation would echo through briefing rooms later. Just before nightfall, the moment that sealed everything happened. The girl with the flower, silent since rescue, did something no one expected. She pressed the wilted blossom gently against her chest and bowed her head. Not in surrender, not in fear, in gratitude. A Marine interpreter witnessed it and later wrote in his logbook. That bow was the first visible death, not of a person, but of a lie. And that was when command understood the truth. The body of Saipan had been won by bullets, but its soul would be won by mercy. The Marines did not know it yet, but upstairs, in strategy rooms soon to follow, mercy would stop being the accident of a soft-hearted private and become engineered policy. Because if kindness could unmake indoctrination here, what would happen when it reached Japan? The lie had cracked. Now someone would decide whether to drive a wedge into that opening and shatter the myth completely. The report did not travel upward as a humanitarian note. It moved like a spark hunting fuel. By the time it reached Division Command, the language had changed. It was no longer, "The civilians responded to kindness." It had become, "Fear collapsed under contradiction." And contradiction in war is leverage. Colonel Abernathy wasn't a sentimental man. He didn't see flowers or blankets or bandages. He saw fracture points, places where belief bends and leadership loses its grip. In a war built on obedience, belief was territory, and they had just captured their first inch of it without firing a shot. The next morning, medics received quiet instructions. Do not discourage interaction. Let them see we do not harm them. Not feed them, not guard them, not question them. Let them be seen. That is how mercy becomes strategy. Not grand gestures, but relentless contradiction. Small acts that erode fear faster than leaflets ever could. The women were moved from the battlefield to a safe zone medical perimeter. But there were no barbed fences, no chains, no locked doors. At first they assumed this was a trick, a temporary calm before humiliation. Yet days passed. No. Violation came. A young survivor finally asked through trembling lips, "Why?" It wasn't curiosity. It was disorientation. The Marines did not answer with speeches. They answered with proof again and again in ways too consistent to dismiss. When it rained, the guards moved them under canvas before themselves. When supplies ran low, medics gave up their own rations to keep the civilians fed. When 2 children began coughing blood, an American doctor sprinted, not walked, to treat them. This was no longer kindness. This was policy. And word started leaking, not to Japan, not yet, but between the survivors themselves. Where language cannot reach, behavior does. The first shift was physical. Their posture changed from curled defense to cautious uprightness. The second shift was social. Whispers turned to questions. Questions turned to stunned conversations. Conversations turned to tears. The kind people cry only when their world is being rewritten. But the most important shift was internal. They stopped seeing the Americans as predators. They started seeing them as human. That alone is a battlefield victory. Because once you see the enemy as human, you must ask the next unbearable question. What does that make the people who told you they were monsters? That question traveled further than any rifle round. Higher command took notice. Not long after, a small intelligence unit arrived, not to interrogate the women but to listen. They didn't ask about troop placements or supply lines. They wanted to understand what the women believed, what lies had been planted, what terrors were most effective. The answers were staggering. They told us your soldiers carry knives for cutting women. They said you take children as trophies. They said mercy is a trick before shame. When the intel officer heard that last line, he wrote only 2 words in his notebook: cultural detonation. Because now it was clear, Japan was not winning with bullets. Japan was winning with terror stories. And terror stories can be killed by witnesses. What happens when civilians return alive, untouched, respected? The rumor becomes louder than the myth. The Marine Corps didn't just permit the civilians to heal now. They began planning for their survival as message. Food distribution became structured. Clothing was provided, not simply uniforms or cast-offs, but garments chosen to restore dignity. Nurses taught hygiene. Interpreters arranged basic conversation exchange. At night, small lamps stayed lit so the women would never feel watched in darkness. If indoctrination strips agency, mercy restores it. But make no mistake, this was no longer charity. This was psychological warfare at its most elegant. No blood, no chains, no fire, just truth carefully allowed to breathe. It was around this point that the U.S. Pacific Command received reports and quietly approved a new directive. Humane treatment of captured Japanese civilians is not only moral, it is strategically advantageous. Kindness had become a tool of conquest. And inside Japan, though they did not know it yet, the emperor's greatest weapon, fear, had begun to rot. The surviving women did not know they had become part of a larger plan. To them, the change was simpler. The enemy had become a contradiction they could not explain away. One of them said softly to another, "If the Americans are monsters, why do they behave like men?" Another whispered back, "If they gave me death, I would understand it. But life? I do not know how to wear life anymore." Here is the pivot. Fear had been replaced not by trust, but by possibility. Possibility is far more dangerous to tyranny than rebellion. Because once a person sees life where they expected only death, they begin to choose it. And soon, command would decide. This rumor must not die here on Saipan. It must travel. It must spread. Not by broadcast. Not by leaflet. Not by force. By witness. The civilians would become living messages. Proof that the story told by Tokyo was collapsing. And once a story collapses, the empire that built it begins to fall with it. The only remaining question was simple. Who would be sent back first to carry the rumor home? Rumors are lighter than ash, faster than bullets, and deadlier than truth told too early. They slip through hands that try to contain them. They move in silence, carried not by shouting generals, but by trembling survivors whispering, "I lived, and they didn't touch me." The first woman returned under Red Cross escort not as a spy or bargaining peace, but as an accident of survival made visible. Her arrival did not make headlines. Fear regimes never publicize contradiction. But her presence torched uncertainty into every room she entered. She was supposed to be dead. She was supposed to be destroyed. Instead, she was alive, calm, unbroken. That alone was treason against the narrative. Neighbors stared longer than politeness allowed. Mothers asked hushed questions. Younger girls watched her walk and thought, "She is not shamed. She is not ruined. Then why did we fear?" And like embers in brush, the whisper spread. The Americans treated her gently. No speech from Tokyo could silence it. Because rumor is born from contrast, not permission. Soon, other survivors were moved, not as a coordinated propaganda campaign, but because logistical releases and recovery required relocation. Each time one crossed a boundary, from camp to relay station, from island to vessel, from caretaker to courier, she left in her wake a new fracture line in the myth. Some soldiers on the Japanese side tried to dismiss it. American trickery. Staged mercy. A trap for morale. But what do you call a trap that frees instead of chains? The Imperial Command sensed danger. They knew what they were watching, not treason of body, but treason of belief. So they tried to quarantine rumor. They locked down survivors' travel. They ordered silence. But censorship cannot kill what people have seen with their own eyes. You can ban a message. You cannot unlive a miracle. And here lies the paradox neither empire planned for. Once people understood that living capture was possible, death was no longer patriotic. It was unnecessary. This shift did not arrive as rebellion or protest. It arrived as hesitation. A soldier too slow to obey a suicide charge. A mother who pulls her daughter back from a cliff edge. A farmer who chooses surrender over starvation. Not loud. Not heroic. Just human. The American High Command began quietly tracking surrender incidents linked to rumor spread. What they found stunned them. In villages where returned women had been seen, resistance dropped by half. Civilians no longer ran from the Americans. Some waited for them. Not because of loyalty, because the myth had cracked. An empire can survive defeat, cannot survive disbelief. And disbelief was spreading. Back in the holding camp on Saipan, the surviving women were beginning to shift from rescued to rehabilitated. They started speaking more openly, looking Marines in the eyes, not with fear now, but with something else. Cautious gratitude, and behind that, awakening. One evening at dusk, a survivor asked a translator a question no one expected. If your soldiers died for us, then are we your burden or your proof? He replied gently, neither. You are your own proof. She cried until her shoulders shook. This is the part the battlefield never shows. War does not end when guns stop. It ends when fear stops being believable. And fear was dying here. It died each time a woman slept without terror. It died each time a Marine saluted her dignity. It died every hour that passed without the monster arriving. The Americans had not conquered them. Mercy had. It became clear to command that the war Japan was fighting was no longer geographic. It was psychological. Cities could burn and still obey. Armies could shrink and still obey. But the moment belief cracked, the nation itself began to tilt inward. And the crack came from women who should have died, but didn't. It came from guards who should have taken, but gave flowers instead. No general planned this. But once discovered, strategy embraced it. History books call Saipan a military victory. But that is incomplete. Saipan was a narrative collapse. The women didn't win a battle. They broke a spell. And in the long, subtle chain of events that followed, from these cliffs to whisper networks, from whisper networks to hesitation, from hesitation to surrender, mercy spread like an unseen contagion. A rumor did what artillery could not. By the time the emperor announced surrender later in the war, millions believed it was duty. But somewhere deep beneath that obedience lay a simpler truth. The war had already ended the moment fear lost its throne. It ended the moment a flower was placed in shaking hands. And here, after all the ruin and smoke and shattered faith, history leaves us with a question. What if the greatest victory of the Pacific War was not forged by fire, but by restraint? Because in the end, armies can conquer land. But only humanity can conquer a lie. Some wars are won by weapons. Others are undone by the moment someone chooses not to use one. If this story moved you, stay with us. There are more secrets buried beneath the ashes of history, waiting for light.